Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Miyoo A30. This is a new horizontal handheld from the same creators of the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus. These were super popular handhelds over the past couple of years, and I think a lot of people are expecting the same. Now, for all intents and purposes, this looks and feels like a horizontal version of the Miyoo Mini. It's got the same button feel, same size screen, and is also very pocketable. And there are a lot of people like me who prefer horizontal handhelds over vertical ones, and so this one looks to be a lot more comfortable too. And I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not lightning will strike twice. Is the Miyoo A30 going to be a massive hit like it was with the Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus? And I'm going to cut right to the chase. I think that the A30 has a lot of potential to be awesome, but it is still a bit of a work in progress. In addition, the environment in which the Miyoo A30 is releasing is a lot more complicated than it was just a couple years back. There's a lot more competition and some really good choices out there as well. And so in this video, I'm going to treat it like a preliminary review. I'm going to take a look at all the things that I can make a quick judgment about, things like ergonomics in the buttons and the screen, and we'll also talk about the software as well, and how it compares against others on the market, at least right now. Anyway, we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I think you should probably grab a snack and drink for this one. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start with the specs. The CPU is the all-winner A33 that has 4 A7 cores. It also has a Mali GPU with 512 megabytes of RAM. The display specs are the same as the original Miyoo Mini, so 2.8 inches and 640 by 480 resolution. Of note, like the Anbernic RG28XX that I reviewed last week, this one also has a rotated panel. The battery is 2500 mAh, which has given me between 2 and 4 hours of gameplay, depending on the system I'm playing, and then also whether or not I'm overclocking. And the device is relatively lightweight, 112 grams. In terms of connectivity, we have 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi. It's always awesome to see that in a small device like this. It's also running its own stock Linux-based operating system. And finally, the device does not have a headphone jack, but it does support USB-C audio, which we will test later in this video. Now, as of making this video, the device is not officially released yet. I've heard that it may be coming pretty soon from Miyoo themselves, but there are some third-party retailers who are already accepting pre-orders. One of them is KeepRetro.com, who sent me over this review unit to make for this video. And the way this works is they will accept a bunch of pre-orders, and then when they get the device in hand, then they'll ship it out to everybody else. And right now, they're estimating that they will ship them out before June 25th, although it may be earlier. And so it's totally up to you whether or not you want to take a chance by ordering it directly from Miyoo on their AliExpress website, or getting it from Keep Retro with the peace of mind of knowing that it will ship eventually. And it looks like there are going to be 4 different colorways available, and some of these look pretty great. Anyway, let's move over to the unboxing. Like I mentioned, this is a review unit sent over to me from Keep Retro. And they did confirm that every device is going to come with this carrying case, much like the original Miyoo Mini. Now inside we have a USB-A to USB-C charging cable, and then also a USB-C to headphone jack adapter. Further inside we have an instruction manual that looks almost identical to the original Miyoo Mini one. So it'll give you a couple tips about how to launch a game, and then also how to use the quick menu. We'll go over all this stuff later. For now, let's jump into my initial impressions of the Miyoo A30. And as you can see, I got the red and gold model, so very similar to the original Nintendo Famicom. And first impression, this is a very lightweight device for its size. It feels a little bit hollow on the inside. And that gives it a bit of a cheap feel to it, especially when you combine that with the plastic texture. This plastic is relatively smooth and kind of smudgy, as you can see here on the back, after just about an hour of playing with it. And so yeah, I think that's my first impressions here, that it's pretty lightweight and cheap feeling, and also kind of blocky just overall. If anything, it feels more like a classic design, like an old NES controller, but a little bit more rounded. So yes, even though it is cheap, it's almost nostalgic in that way as well. Let's move on to the controls and talk about the D-pad first. Now, as a whole, this does feel a lot like the D-pad on the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus, although it feels like it has a little bit less pivot than the others. By that I mean that when you press on the center of the D-pad, it doesn't rotate as much as you might think. Instead, the whole D-pad just kind of depresses down. Now, this is a rubber membrane D-pad, much like other classic controllers, and so it's a very familiar and classic feel, but that lack of pivot does make it feel a little bit mushier than I was expecting. Now, the feel of a D-pad on its own is not the end of the world, so let's do a real-time test. We'll start with the Contra test. And here what I like to do is press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And ideally, the character will only minimally move depending on how far I rock it back and forth. However, as you can see here, the character is moving all over the place. This is unfortunately an indication that this device is probably going to be prone to accidental diagonals. And so unfortunately, just on this initial test here, it is absolutely failing the contra test pretty hard. And so if you are playing a game that's more precision-minded, like a platformer, something along those lines, then this might be an issue for you. And unfortunately, this was the opposite experience of the original Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus. As you can see here, when I do the exact same test, the character only moves a little bit, and I have to really push it left or right to get them to even move. And this right here is the ideal for a classic D-pad, and unfortunately the A30 is not able to replicate it. Now, Miyoo is a company who is known for making revisions of their models, and so hopefully this is something that may get addressed in the future, but I think with these initial shipments, you will probably not have a great time. The other test I like to do is with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. So here I'm testing out a Hadouken and Shoryuken to see how easy it is to press the diagonal when you want to. And right here we see that it is playing just fine, and that makes sense. If it's easy to press a diagonal when using Contra, it's going to be easy with Street Fighter 3. And so it will depend on the game and how it affects your gameplay, but at least as it stands right now, it does feel like this D-pad is a downgrade from their previous model. And it is a bit confusing as to why they got this one wrong. After all, they just nailed it with the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus, so why weren't they able to do that here as well? Next, let's test out the analog stick. I was looking forward to testing this because I like the idea of having a single analog stick on a smaller device. Now, this is just using the same standard analog stick you will find on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, and so if you've ever used a Nintendo Switch before, you're probably going to know how this feels. The analog stick itself is recessed quite a bit. It actually sticks out just about the same as the D-pad. And so just in terms of keeping it flush with the device so that it doesn't stick out too much, I think they did that pretty well. Now, in terms of movement, it doesn't feel like you have a huge range to it, mostly because it is so inset. But when playing a game that will rely on a stick, for example Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, or arcade games, I'd rather use this than a D-pad. And one other thing worth mentioning, when you're using the D-pad, it doesn't feel like it gets in the way. Your thumb will definitely press down on it, but it doesn't inhibit the movement of the D-pad itself. And so I think that's kind of ideal when it comes to an analog stick on the left side. If I had to make any nitpicks about it, it would be that I wish the analog stick itself was a little bit more inboard or towards the screen. I think that would make for a more comfortable experience overall, and there's definitely room for it here on the left. Okay, next let's take a look at these face buttons, and these are very similar to what they were on the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus with one specific distinction, and that is these are textured buttons as opposed to glossy. But other than that, they have a very similar feel. They stick out about the same amount from the case, and they're easy to press down on. These are the kind of buttons that I feel like I could press for hours on end, so no complaints there, and I also like the size of them too. If we break out the calipers, you can see that they are 7.83 millimeters, and that's about the same size as they were on the Miyoo Mini, if a little bit smaller, but only by a hair. And I think that's a pretty solid size for a small device like this. If you watched my Anbernic RG28XX video, one of my main complaints was that I felt like the buttons were too small. And here you can see they are about 1.5 millimeters smaller on this device. And so if anything, it does make me wish that the Anbernic RG28XX had these same size buttons here, because there's definitely room for it. If Miyoo can fit them in, then why can't Anbernic? Anyway, we'll do more comparisons between these two devices here later in this video because I think a lot of people are trying to decide between these two. But at least when it comes to the size of the face buttons, then the Miyoo A30 is a clear winner. And it is pretty comfortable to use a horizontal device like this where you have easy access to the D-pad and face buttons without feeling too cramped. Also on the right side we have our select and start buttons. These are micro switch or maybe dome switch connections. They're relatively quiet and soft to press down on. And then finally on the bottom right corner we have our single mono speaker. Let's do a quick sound test. I think the audio here is pretty good considering this is a device that's around $50–$55. The speaker itself gets quite loud and also has a fair amount of clarity, so no complaints from me when it comes to the audio. On the right side we have a single power button and then 2 LED indicators. If we plug in a charging cable, you will see that the top one will turn red, and when we turn on the device, the bottom one will turn blue. Now I tested with a bunch of different cables and charging plugs and I found that a standard USB-A to USB-C worked fine, but when it came to USB-C power delivery chargers, I tested it on 25, 45, and 65 watt chargers. none of them would charge the device. The only time I could get a USB-C to USB-C cable to actually charge the device is when I use something at a very low wattage, like a 10-watt charger. And so I'm not saying it's incapable of charging from a USB-C charging brick, it's really going to depend on the power delivery as well as the cable too. Either way, it won't be effortless charging like how it is with a smartphone. Next, we'll take a look up top. So we have shoulder and trigger buttons and they're all in one line. And in general, I do like these. They are very similar in feel to the shoulder and trigger buttons on the original Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus. So they do have a micro switch connection, but there's enough padding here to make it really soft and a little bit mushy. The best thing about this setup is that it's also ultra quiet, and so I actually like these shoulder and trigger buttons. They are easy to press down on. Also up top we have our home button and then also a USB-C port. Now in addition to charging, this can also be used for audio, so let's test out that adapter that comes with it. And sure enough, yes, when plugging it into my earphones, they sound fine. The only big issue here is that the sound coming out is mono. And so that's unfortunate for me. Not only do we have to use a USB-C port to even use headphones, even then we don't even get stereo sound. And so I think in terms of just personal audio quality, I think the A30 falls kind of short. Now a lot of people were excited about the idea of maybe using a USB-C Bluetooth adapter, so you could plug this in and then connect it to some headphones and then you would have wireless audio. And this adapter is made by a company named Genki. It's actually originally made for the Nintendo Switch back before they had Bluetooth audio. And unfortunately, I can't get this thing to work with the Miyoo A30. It doesn't light up at all and won't connect to my headphones. And so my guess here is that the USB-C port up top is not providing enough power to actually use it. And so even though it would be cool to use a Bluetooth adapter like this, I don't see it working unless the adapter itself has its own internal battery. Moving on, finally up top we also have our volume up and down. Let's go over the rest of the device. So on the left side we don't have anything, and then on the bottom we have a single microSD card slot. And every Miyoo A30 should come with a microSD card. Mine right here came with a standard 64GB card. And it did come preloaded with games, although the games library was not fully comprehensive. And then finally, let's take another look at the back. So here we have the Miyoo logo and then also some of the specs for the battery. And the specs here say that it's a 2600 milliamp hour battery, although some of the pages I've seen say 2500, so I'm not really sure what the exact number is. And as I mentioned before, the back plastic will get a little bit smudgy. Next, we'll take a look at the screen. So this is 2.8 inches and all of the bezels are actually covered by the case itself. So that does give you a bit of an immersive quality. Speaking of case, these metal faceplates on the front were initially supposed to be swappable. We actually saw some teaser images from Miyoo last year. Well, I'm here to report that they look to be glued on, so you're not going to be able to change out these faceplates unless you want to rip it off. Anyway, yeah, that's about it when it comes to the hardware and the I/O. The only other thing I want to mention just again is the fact that it does feel a little bit squarish and blocky in the hands. And I wouldn't classify this as being a bad thing. It just feels more like an 80s controller more than anything. In fact, if we compare it to the original Famicom controller, you can see that they are pretty similar in many ways. Obviously, they both have gold plating on the front, but the shape and size is not far off either. Now, the red coloring on the original Famicom is a lot brighter than the Miyoo, but I don't mind the dark color on the A30 either. So I think they did a pretty good job of being faithful to a device that came out like 40 years ago, which is crazy, and also keeping it a little bit more modern feeling as well. Next, I want to move into size and weight comparisons. We'll go directly to the original Miyoo Mini first. And as you can see, it is a little bit larger than the original Miyoo Mini, but honestly not by much. As I'll show here in a minute, both of these devices are insanely pocketable. Next, we have the Bittboy Pocket Go. Now, Bittboy and Miyoo are basically the same company as far as I can tell, and so this is more like an upgrade of the original Pocket Go when this one came out about 4 or 5 years ago. Another similar device is the Bittboy Pocket Go S30. This one came out about 3 years ago now. And the most interesting thing about these two is that they have the exact same chipset. So when it comes to performance comparisons, this is kind of a known quantity. And I made a bunch of videos about this device when it first came out. In fact, I even made my own custom launcher. It is called Simple30. And part of me was hoping that I could just take my SD card, which had been meticulously created over the past few years, and then just plug it directly into the Miyoo A30 and it would work. But of course, reality set in, given the fact that this is a completely different screen with a different resolution and aspect ratio, and so of course, yes, I tried putting this card in the A30 and it did not work. And that's kind of a bummer, but I didn't have super high hopes about it anyway. Either way, yes, the S30 is quite a bit bigger than the A30, so let's move on to more size comparisons. Next is the TrimUI Smart. This one has a smaller screen, 2.4 inches, and is a little bit smaller as you can see. And if we want to go even smaller, here's a comparison against the Game Boy Micro, which again has a Famicom style design. And then finally, here is the Anbernic RG28XX, and these are very similar in many ways. In addition to having a similar size, these screens are also almost identical, so both are 2.8 inches and with a 480p resolution. Now in terms of weight, it's 112 grams, which puts it kind of in the middle of all of these small handhelds. It's heavier than the TrimUI Smart and the original Miyoo Mini, but not by much. It's also slightly lighter than the Anbernic RG28XX. And then finally, there's quite a big weight difference between the A30 and the Miyoo Mini Plus. So when it comes down to it, in terms of just size and pocketability, I think that the Miyoo A30 really nailed it because it's very easy to throw in your pocket. Even though it has an analog stick, it doesn't really get caught at all. And I think that's one of the big draws of this device. Not only is it horizontal and more comfortable to hold than the original Miyoo Mini, but it feels just as pocketable as the other one as well. And it's basically the identical experience to the Anbernic RG28XX. Both of these are very pocketable in that regard. And if we do a side-by-side comparison, you can see that they are almost identical. They're about the same thickness, same height, same width. And so I wouldn't say that one is more pocketable than the other at all. The shapes of them are a little bit different, especially in that bottom right corner where the Anbernic one is a little bit more inset like the original Game Boy. But honestly, if we're just talking about size and pocketability, it's really splitting hairs because they are basically identical. And so yeah, long story short, if you are looking for a smallish handheld that is very pocketable, then you cannot go wrong with the Miyoo A30. Okay, next we're going to turn it on and talk about the software experience. Now this is running the stock operating system and it's very similar if you've ever used a Miyoo Mini or Plus before. And it takes about 17 seconds to boot up altogether, and you can also see that the default theme is different from the original Miyoo Mini. This one has a more machine or Gundam style to it. And the bones of the OS itself are very similar, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly. On the far left, we have our Recents category, which will go through your most recently played games. And then to the right of that, there is a Favorites category, so you can set this up yourself. After that, we have the Games folder. This is going to show 16 different systems that can be played on this device. And of note, there are some new additions compared to the Miyoo Mini because this processor is a bit more powerful. And so there are now categories for Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and even PlayStation Portable. Now when it comes to launching a game, it's very simple. You would just pick the system, press A, and then you'll see a games list. And like I mentioned, this will be pre-populated with games, and so you'll navigate here, press the A button to launch the game, and there you go. Now to the right of that, we have the RetroArch setting. So this is going to show all the various RetroArch cores that you can launch. And so if you pick one of these and then open it up, it's going to show you the same game list from the same system, but you will launch it with that specific RetroArch core. Now personally, I'm not really sure if this is going to be a necessary component because if you just go back into the games list and then pick a game, you can actually specify which core to launch it with. All you have to do is hover over it and then press the X button. And so this gives you the exact same choice that you had before without having to search by individual core. Instead, you'll search by system and then game and then choose your core, and I think that is a little bit more of a logical approach. Now further to the right in the main menu, we have the app section. We have two options here, a USB storage option which will allow you to directly access the SD card from a computer, and then also you can launch RetroArch directly from here. And then finally after that, we have the settings menu, again very similar to the original Miyoo Mini. First thing we'll talk about is the brightness, and we have a range of 0 to 10, so 11 factors altogether. And there's a pretty good range here, and it's skewed more towards the dim side. In fact, when you put it at 0 brightness, it is very dim, so you'll be able to play this in the dark, no problem. And the 10 does get fairly bright, but it wasn't impressively bright if you ask me. And below the brightness, we have a color option, and we have different parameters we can adjust, like with the original Miyoo Mini 2. And by default, they're all set to 10, and I found that that actually is a pretty good color balance and saturation. And so in all of my testing, I found that I didn't need to adjust the coloring at all. It actually looked fairly good and accurate. Now, going back to the brightness factor, I did find this to be a relatively dim screen, all things considered. In fact, when compared to the Miyoo Mini, you can see that when both of them are at max brightness, there's a big difference between the two. I think it'll still be okay to play in a brightly lit environment, but this is not a device I would want to play outdoors at all. To give you more context, when I did my RG28XX video last week, I complained about the dimness of that screen. But by comparison, you can see that the A30 is quite a bit dimmer than that. Not only that, the viewing angles are pretty poor, although that's not a measurement that means a lot to me because most of the time when you're playing a game, you're going to be looking at it straight on. If anything, it is an indication that the panel itself feels relatively cheap. Not only is it dim, but it doesn't have viewing angles that are great either. And so I would say that compared to the original Miyoo Mini, this panel feels a bit like a downgrade. Okay, next in the settings list, we have different languages we can choose from. There is traditional and simplified Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, and Portuguese. Below that, we have a calibration option, and this is going to be for the analog stick. And setting this up is very easy. All you have to do is just rotate the analog stick a little bit and then let it calibrate itself. And I will say that when I first turned on this device, I was getting some stick drift to the left, and by doing this calibration, it fixed it. So I would consider that to be a good thing in the fact that we can calibrate it and it does work. Below that, we have a joypad test if you want to check it out and make sure that you're not getting stick drift. Below that, we also have a key mapping function, so if you want to reset your keys, you can do that, but I'm not really sure you'll be using this very often. Further down, we have a Wi-Fi option, so here you can connect to your local network and then also access the internet. And I did test it out and it worked great. Next, let's talk about the themes, and there's a lot available. I think there's at least 20 here right now. And these are a mixture of various themes that I've seen before, mostly coming from Onion OS. In fact, there are Onion-specific themes on here that you could install if you would like. And I found it pretty ironic because on the front page, it will now say Onion OS, even though this is not running Onion. It's just running in the stock UI. Also, one thing of note, when changing out these themes, it only changes this front page. So when you go into the actual games or RetroArch section, it's still going to show those original icons. So it's kind of a half theme if you really think about it. Personally, I've been using this theme called Kala, and that's because it doesn't say the word Onion OS on it, so it's not very confusing, and I like that it's a little bit cute and bright. Now below that, we have the CPU frequency setting. So this gives you multiple different options, and it turns out that you actually need to get familiar with this if you want to make sure that you can play games at their max potential. And I'll show you what I mean later in the video when we get to our testing. Below that, we have a hibernate function, so this will put the device to sleep at 5, 15, and 30-minute increments. Further down, we have our USB storage mode, so this is the same as that app that we were looking at earlier. Essentially, you just turn this on, then connect it to your computer via USB, and then you will be able to access your SD card. And then finally, last thing within the settings to check is the device info, just to show that the firmware here is a revision from April of this year. Now let's start up a game and talk about the in-game menu. So I'm just going to pick a random game here within the NES, and to get into the main menu, all you would do is press that home button up top. And this in-game menu is the same as it was on the Miyoo Mini. Here you can save or load a save state, and then they also have something called the native menu. And this will just bring up the RetroArch quick menu if you want to make some more granular changes. And below that we have a netplay option, and this just opens up the netplay function within RetroArch, so it's not going to be a quick netplay like how it is on Onion OS. And then finally we can also exit the game. Now one thing of note, this device is capable of a sleep function, and you can do this while in a game, which is pretty handy. And so here I'm going to start up Pokemon Ruby version, and I'm using this at a 4 out of 10 brightness, which is an important factor here in a moment. Anyway, to put it to sleep, you just tap on the power button. The blue light will go off after a second, and then you're good to go. And I did test this overnight last night, so I left it untouched in sleep mode for about 10 hours while a game was playing. And when I came back to it, it lost about 10% battery, so I think that's pretty good all things considered. Now earlier I mentioned that when I put the device to sleep, it was at 4 out of 10 brightness. And the reason I said that is because when you wake the device back up, it's going to automatically go to max brightness no matter what. And the only way to get it to go back down to 4 out of 10 brightness is to exit the game and go back to the main menu. As soon as you get back into the menu, it'll go back to that original brightness. And so this is kind of a pain in the butt. If you think about it, maybe you're playing at 4 out of 10, then you put it to sleep and then wake it back up. You're not going to be able to just jump right back into your game unless you don't mind having a really bright screen. Instead, you'll have to close out of the game and then start it back up so that you can get back to 4 out of 10. So this is a way where the sleep function works, and that's great, but then it also is kind of broken and is a little bit annoying to actually use. Anyway, that's a quick recap of the software experience. Let's now move into game testing because I have other things I want to talk about the software as we go through. To start, we'll talk about performance on the low-end systems, so things like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. All these played no problem. I didn't have any games that had any slowdown. And same thing when it came to most of the retro home consoles. Things like NES and Genesis, again, played no problem. Now, one interesting thing I found with MAME is that the analog stick was not properly mapped. Everything was mapped to the D-pad instead of the stick, which I thought was kind of a waste. Thankfully, it's pretty easy to change that, so let me show you really quickly what to do. You just want to go into the native menu, which will bring up RetroArch Quick Menu, and then go into Controls. And within the Port 1 controls, you can see that the D-pad is mapped to the joystick, but the analog stick is not. So all you really have to do is just map all of these directions to the appropriate joystick direction, and you'll be good to go. Once you've set those four, go back up to the top and then select Manage Remap File. Then you've got a couple different options of how to save it. I personally would recommend saving it as a content directory remap file. This means that anytime you open up any game that's within the MAME folder, no matter what core you use, it's going to use the analog stick. And that's it. Once you have it saved, all your arcade games are going to work properly. Now, when it comes to arcade game performance, most of your lightweight games will play no problem, but I did find that heavyweight games had a lot of slowdown. For example, with Ninja Baseball Batman, this one is nowhere close to full speed. It's actually at about half speed. And another weird thing is that the select button is tied to the third player as well. So if you play any game that has more than 2 players, you're going to get multiple players in the game. Again, this is something that will need to get remapped within those controls. And unfortunately, performance just kind of takes a nosedive from there. For example, if we try to play Super Nintendo with the default settings, even something like Mega Man X does not play at full speed. Same thing with harder to run Super Nintendo games like Star Fox, this one's only running at 2/3 speed. So this is where that overclocking will come into play. Back in the settings, we have the CPU frequency. If we set it to 1.3 gigahertz, then we can actually get pretty good performance. So for example, with Super Nintendo, yes, all these games will now play at full speed. But there is a downside to this in that the battery will drain faster and also the device will get quite warm. And it's not super uncomfortable, and I wouldn't call it hot by any measure, but it is still more warm than I would like. And it's definitely not a catch-all. It's not going to fix every single game. For example, Ninja Baseball Batman gets a lot closer to full speed, but doesn't quite get there. However, I did find that for anything that is Super Nintendo and higher, clocking it to a higher clock speed is almost necessary. For example, here with Tekken 3, this game plays at about 35 to 40 frames per second in the default settings. Meanwhile, if we set it to the highest clock speed, then yes, it will play at full speed. And so I would say that yes, every PS1 game is going to be fully playable, but you may have to adjust the clock speed to get it to work properly. It's going to be a similar story with Nintendo 64, but with lower dividends. For example, here with Diddy Kong Racing, it's playing at about 2/3, maybe half speed. It's not very good at all. And that's a bummer because this is a pretty lightweight game. It's the same story with Mario Kart 64. This one plays at about 2/3 speed, and you can hear all sorts of stuttering and crackling the entire time. Now, if we turn on the overclock, it does fix these games. It doesn't make them perfect. They still struggle to maintain a full frame rate, but they are a lot closer. So as long as you're willing to play more lightweight Nintendo 64 games with the overclock on, which is going to give you lower battery life, and if you're willing to deal with a couple stutters here and there, then it's going to be an okay experience. And this is one of those systems where I'm thankful to have an analog stick because it does improve the overall gameplay as well, having the ability to use the analog stick in the first place. Now, another thing I noticed when trying to play PlayStation Portable games in particular, that these actually ran really well. In fact, out of the box, these run better than Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. And this leads me down 2 different rabbit holes. The first is that PSP is not that great on this device in the first place, given the fact that it's a wider aspect ratio and we have a smaller screen. It's only 2.8 inches. And so trying to play 16:9 content on a 4:3 screen this small makes it very, very squinty. The second rabbit hole is the fact that this plays so well on this chipset in the first place. And this leads me to think that the reason why we're seeing bad performance with Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast isn't really having to do with the chipset, but rather the optimization of these emulators. And so it does leave me with some hope that we will see improvements in performance down the line once things get more updated and optimized. Because when it comes down to it, the fact that this can play PSP so well, even with like Ridge Racer, that means that we have a lot of performance still on the table. But at least now, when it comes to a stock experience, it does leave a lot to be desired. Let's use Dreamcast as our last example. So here I'm going to run it at a 240p resolution with frame skip on. So this is a half resolution of the Dreamcast itself, and even then it is nowhere close to full speed. Bear in mind this is with the default settings, so no overclock, but as you can see, it's playing at about 2/3 speed, so it's pretty bad. If we turn the overclocking on, it gets a little bit better, I would say maybe 3 frames per second on average. But because it still can't reach 30 frames per second, you're not going to get a very fluid experience. And that's because even with frame skip on, it still needs to reach 30 to play smoothly. And so honestly, this is just not an experience I would want to play on the Dreamcast here with the A30. And it really does contrast the difference between this device and the RG28XX from Anbernic. This one has a much more modern and powerful chipset and can play games like Crazy Taxi 2 no problem. It still does require frame skip, but even at a 480p resolution, so double that of the A30, it is well above 30 frames per second at all times. That means that you won't have any of those stutters that we were just experiencing, even though we are demanding more of the CPU. And that's kind of the magic of this device, in that it can play most Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 games without having to push it too far. And the fact that we can even play these systems on a device so small is kind of a marvel, and unfortunately I don't get that same feeling with the A30. However, we're getting a little bit too close to actually comparing these two, and I want to do that later in the video. Before that, let's actually start wrapping up and talking about what I like and what I don't like about this device. We'll start with what I like, and the first is that I like that it's small and portable. I know that a lot of people would rather have a larger device because it's more comfortable, but for me personally, I like these little devices. It means that I can throw them in my pocket and take them around with me. I also like the face buttons on this device. At first, I wasn't too hip on the fact that they weren't glossy, but I like the size and the feel of them overall. I also think that the operating system that comes with this device is not half bad. It definitely has its share of bugs, especially the sleep thing that I was mentioning before, but it can get in and out of your games pretty easily. I also like that it has a universal in-game menu system. It makes it pretty easy to be able to save your game and load it up without any issue. Now that being said, there's still a wide gap between the experience on this device and what you can get on Onion OS, and so I do hope that Onion does come to this device at some point in the future. Now the team themselves have not made a decision of whether or not they're going to try to port it over. After all, it's a different chipset, so it will require quite a bit of work. And also remember that it's a rotated screen, so that's going to cause some issues for them as well. However, if they do choose to port Onion over to the A30, I think it's going to be great for everybody. Not only will it improve the navigation experience, but I bet they can optimize some of those cores as well. Another thing I like about this device is it has built-in Wi-Fi. That's a feature that you won't find in a lot of small handhelds, so I'm always happy to see it. And then finally, I know this is a divisive topic. Some people like to have an analog stick on a smaller device, some people don't, and I'm team analog stick, so I like the fact that it's there. Personally, I don't think it gets in the way of my gameplay at all, and it's always good to have another input option. Okay, next we'll talk about the things that I don't like about the Miyoo A30, and we gotta start with that D-pad. Unfortunately, I think it's too sensitive, and the lack of pivot makes it feel mushy. And so unfortunately, I would not consider this to be a very precise D-pad because of those diagonals. In addition, I felt like the headphone audio quality was like insult to injury. Not only does it not have a 3.5mm headphone jack, but when you do use the adapter, it's only mono sound. And whether or not this is a big deal for you is really going to depend on whether or not you use headphones with this device, but all the same, it's a feature I wish they had. I also was not a huge fan of the screen. I think it works fine indoors, but it does feel relatively dim. And then also I have this in the don't like category, but it can kind of go either way. The device does feel cheap and a little bit hollow. And that can be a good thing if you want a device to be very lightweight, and also it might be good if you want a nice nostalgic feel to it. But if you're looking for something that has a more solid or premium feel, this device is definitely not that. And then finally, I'm going to lump all the performance issues here at the bottom, and the fact that everything basically from Super Nintendo and beyond will require an overclock. And that overclock works fine for most systems, although it does kind of struggle with Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. But I'm also not comfortable with leaving the overclock on all the time. Not only does it drain the battery a lot, giving me only about 2 hours of battery life, but the device also will get quite warm as you're holding it, and that's never something that I really like. And so I think this is just kind of part and parcel with the fact that they use such a cheap and old chipset. This chip has been around for over 10 years at this point. And as a result, it's not going to be super powerful and also not very efficient. And so that's what I like and what I don't like about the Miyoo A30. And to be honest, I'm surprised by how many things I don't like about this device. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that I just expected this device to be an evolution of the Miyoo Mini and the Miyoo Mini Plus, but it doesn't really feel like it is. And I think to really understand this point, we have to travel back in time a little bit and go into the context of Bittboy and Miyoo and the updates they've done over the years. We're going to start with the Miyoo Mini. So on the left here, we have the original Bittboy. This came out many years ago, actually before I even started collecting these retro handhelds. So I think this is about 5 years old at this point. And the Bittboy definitely shows its age. The D-pad and the face buttons are kind of terrible, but it also has the makings of the original Miyoo Mini. In fact, when you look at the two, you can see the evolution from one to the next. And when compared to one another, it feels like the Miyoo Mini is a slam dunk in every single way. They improved the screen and the controls and the feel and the software, all that stuff into one. And this is the kind of stuff I love to see, when a company takes an older idea and then makes it better and better over time. And so I think it's very clear when it comes to these small vertical handhelds that they had a big improvement between these two. And I think we can make the same argument when it comes to horizontal handhelds if we do a similar comparison. On the left we have the Bittboy Pocket Go. This one also came out before I got into retro handhelds about 5 years ago as well. And again, you can see the evolution between these two. The shape and form factor is very similar, but the Pocket Go had its own share of issues between the face buttons and the D-pad, but then also the screen wasn't great either. And so when you look at the A30, then yes, this is a great evolution from the Pocket Go over into the A30 today. Just about every single thing between the two has been improved over the past 5 years. But the major problem here is that we're not comparing the evolution of the Pocket Go over into the A30. Instead, my expectation is that we should see improvements from the Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus to their latest device. And when comparing these two, it feels like the Miyoo Mini is a more refined and polished product compared to the A30. This one has an element of magical balance to it when it comes to the controls and the software and everything in between. Even though it's been 2 years since the first Miyoo Mini came out, it still feels like it's punching way above its weight class. And not only that, this company iterated on the Miyoo Mini with the Miyoo Mini Plus. This one took everything that was great about the Miyoo Mini and made it better in some key ways. It comes with a larger screen and a more durable form factor, and also better back buttons and Wi-Fi. And these are the kind of improvements that I love to see from one device to the next. And sadly, when you put that all into context and you talk about the improvements from one Miyoo product to the other, I'm just not really seeing it when it comes to the Miyoo A30. There are definitely some things I like about it, like the fact that it's horizontal and has an analog stick, but there are also quite a few things that lead me to think that this is not an improvement or evolution from the Miyoo Mini Plus. There's a lot of things that the A30 gets right, but I would not say this is the best small horizontal handheld on the market right now. And so to really understand where I'm coming from, let's now get into the comparison between this and the Anbernic RG28XX. And I will start by saying this is not a cut and dry comparison between the two, because there are some elements that are better on one than the other. And I'm going to go into this video assuming that you've already checked out my video on the Anbernic, or maybe you'll check it out right after this one. Either way, on the left column you can see all of the features that are highlighted on the Anbernic RG28XX that are not present on the Miyoo A30. This one has much better performance and has HDMI out, and I would also argue it's a better D-pad. It also has a headphone jack, as well as an imperfect but better screen, and also a larger battery with better battery life because of the efficiency of its chipset. In addition, I like the plastic texture better on the Anbernic because it's a little bit more gritty and feels better in the hand, but then also doesn't get smudgy. And then finally, there is already custom firmware that is likely going to be introduced for this device in the future. Meanwhile, the A30 does have some features that I really like. It's got built-in Wi-Fi that I wish the Anbernic had, and it also has an analog stick, which again, I would really love to have on the Anbernic too. I also think that the face buttons are better on the Miyoo just because they are large. I think the Anbernic ones are still fine, but feel very small. And then finally, we can't discount the fact that we might be getting Onion OS on this device, which I think will elevate it quite a bit more. And so this is a very personal decision between the two, but for me, all the features on the Anbernic do outweigh it over the A30. Neither are going to be perfect, but I just think that the Anbernic has more of those qualities that are really important for me. And I want to be clear that the Anbernic is a better fit for me, but it may not be a better fit for you. Again, it'll really come down to what features are most important for the type of gameplay that you want to do. So in the end, if you are wondering whether or not I recommend the Miyoo A30, I am a little bit torn. If the good stuff like the Wi-Fi and the analog stick outweigh the bad stuff like its D-pad and lack of a headphone jack, and you're willing to take a chance on custom firmware coming for it and improving its gameplay, then sure, I think it's a solid little handheld that gets a lot of things right. But when it comes down to it, I'm not as in love with the Miyoo A30 as I was hoping it would be, at least from this initial experience. And I certainly surprised myself by preferring the Anbernic RG28XX over it, especially considering that I loved the Miyoo devices more than their Anbernic counterparts last time around. Now, of course, I also reserve the right to be a little bit more excited about this device in the future in the event that software updates can bridge that gap a little bit more. But given the constraints that we have this time around, it does feel like the Miyoo A30 has quite a bit of an uphill battle. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you trying to decide between these devices, and is this the one that you're going to pick, or are you going to go somewhere else? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.